In 6 weeks, we write ourselves, with interview, analysis, and poetry. Story the silence. It is like sand seen through a microscope. Each lived experience, a slither of serif, a pairing of periwinkle. No longer lost in beige drifts, we hold piece by piece up to the light, sift rainbows through our fingers. We are contrologists, collecting cantles of discrimination, a poetic inquiry to splinter the softness of sand. Hello. I'm Helen Johnson. You probably worked that bit out because I'm standing at the front. Before I kind of start with this properly, I have to do the kind of a word to our sponsors bit. So the research that I'm going to be talking about was funded by the National Centre for Research Methods. They gave me the money that enabled me to go out to Montreal over the summer and carry out this research and paid for sort of core expenses around the research. And I also got some money from the University of Brighton to help make this happen. So I worked with a group of young spoken word artists who worked as co-researchers with me on the project. And the University of Brighton money paid for some book vouchers for them and some spoken word masterclasses for them. And as you'll see as we kind of go through the project, there was quite a big commitment asked of them. So these book vouchers and the masterclass workshops were kind of necessary really to acknowledge all the work that they put into the project. So those were the two lots of funders that kind of made this possible and made it happen. So the idea of today is that I'm going to spend about half an hour, it's probably going to nudge over a little bit over half an hour, just talking about this research, and that's going to be sort of 3 main blocks. So I want to talk a bit about the background, so a bit about kind of where it sits academically. And I know there's a mix of people in the audience. Some people are academics, some people are artists, and some people are from community organisations. So that will just kind of help to pin it in academia, I guess, and talk about its methodological and theoretical foundations within that. It's not going to be really heavy stuff at all. But the second bit I'm going to be talking about, and this is most of what I'm going to be talking about, is the pilot study, which is the Researching Poetry Through Discrimination study that I carried out in Montreal this summer. So that's most of what I'm going to be talking about, and then I'm going to have a nod to the method. So the point of this study really was to develop a way of working, a way of collaborating with spoken word artists. And so I developed a method of collaborative poetics. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about what that method was in a kind of broader sense, about what I learned and tips and tricks about it. I don't want to go on about that too much. Like Bethan said, I'm going to be doing a workshop on this in January, and the workshop is much more focused on the method. So the workshop is going to be more of a kind of what the method is and a how-to bit about the method. And then this talk is more about the pilot study. So I'm going to try and make it so there's not too much kind of overlap between the two of them. And then we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. So I want to start off with giving you a bit of background, and the pictures you're going to see, all except the one on the next slide, all come from the Montreal work. So hopefully they will also give you a bit of a flavour of the kind of thing that we did. And as you can see from this picture, some of what we did was quite unusual. And not your typical academic research. But I thought that I ought to start off really with telling you a little bit about me, because the kind of research that I did is quite unusual. In terms of kind of social scientific research, and I thought that it might kind of make sense of it to you a little bit if I told you a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. I call myself a social scientist. My background is fairly eclectic in the social sciences. My background is particularly in sociology and in psychology. I work in the School of Applied Social Sciences as a psychology lecturer at the moment at the University of Brighton. But I don't generally find it massively helpful to police those disciplinary boundaries. So I tend to think of myself as a social scientist kind of more broadly than that. But I'm also a poet. So I'm also a performance poet, a spoken word poet. And I've been writing and performing poetry for longer than I've been an academic. So for me, this was a way of kind of bringing all of myself into a research project, which was really, really nice, and a really nice thing to be able to do. I also run poetry events, so I run the poetry stage at Glastonbury Festival. I program the poetry at a really nice little local festival called Elderflower Fields as well. And I don't really tend to facilitate poetry workshops now so much, although I did in Montreal, but I have a background as well in poetry workshop facilitation. So this was kind of all of me kind of coming into the project, and might make sense to you as to why a social scientist might think that using poetry as a research method might be an interesting and useful thing to do. So The aims of this project, there were two kind of aims. There was a broad overarching aim, and that was about developing the method. So the idea was to work with young spoken word poets and educators to develop a participatory arts-based research method which can be disseminated for wider use. So it was about developing the method of what I'm calling collaborative poetics. And then within that, the study that I carried out in Montreal, I saw as a pilot study to kind of experiment with ways of working with poets, things that worked, things that didn't work, ways in which this could kind of happen and what might come out of it. And that pilot study was specifically looking at our experiences and our understandings of discrimination. So we use spoken word poetry as a way of exploring and elucidating those experiences. So that's the kind of smaller aim within that broad overarching aim. This is as heavy as it's going to get theoretically. This is the theory slide, pretty much. And it's really just to try and locate, like I say, this method and the study within a broader kind of academic frame. The arts and the sciences, we tend to think about as being kind of polar opposites. So we tend to think about the arts as being about creativity, about subjectivity, about emotionality, about playfulness and all that stuff. And we tend to think about the social sciences and the sciences as being about kind of objective fact-finding and experimentation and that kind of thing. But I think that those differences between the arts and the sciences are actually very much over eggs, and on closer examination they start to kind of disappear a little bit. So actually social scientists are creative, they perform, serendipity plays a role in their research in a way that's very much usually kind of brushed under the carpet, the role of luck and things. Artists work in a systematic way and so on. So those differences kind of disappear a little bit on inspection. And actually the arts and the sciences have a history, a centuries-long history of dialogue between one another. Arts-based research is a more kind of recent development, and it's something that particularly has found its way in recent decades, but within that there's been a kind of peak as well in recent years as well, and there's been a lot of interest around arts-based research recently. And arts-based research we can think of as being a kind of an umbrella term. Within it there are lots of different kind of approaches, kinds of questions you could ask, ways of working and so on. And what they share in common is that they all use the arts in some way as either a process for data collection, data analysis, or data dissemination. So with something like data collection, it might be a method like, say, photo voice, where researchers get participants to go out and take photographs to document their experiences. With something like data analysis, it might be seeing poetry as or creative writing as a kind of analytical exercise, an exercise which enables us to illuminate experiences, not just kind of describe them. And there are some fantastic methods that use poetry. One great method that we used in the course of this research is something called the listening guide, which I haven't really got time to go into, but it's a really interesting method. And one stage of the listening guide is where you create I poems, which is just I followed by a few words that you're using as a data analysis tool. If anyone's coming to the workshop, we're going to do that a bit in the workshop. You'll see more about what I mean about that. And data dissemination is the kind of most widespread form of arts-based research, really. So with that, you're kind of carrying out a standard piece of research, if you like. You're doing interviews and analysing them or whatever it happens to be. But then at the end of it, either instead or as well as publishing your research in an academic article, you're writing a poem, or you're making a film, or you're creating a dance, or you're creating visual representations of your research. And that's probably the most common form of arts-based research. But one of the real advantages of arts-based research is around impacts and engagement. So it has the potential to access much broader and much larger audiences than standard kind of academic work. So it can reach people, it can reach new people, it can also reach people in different ways and on different levels. It's more emotional, it's more engaging, it's more meaningful, it's more accessible to a lot of people than your standard academic article or textbook. And this means that it has potential for high impact. It has potential to really make a difference to people, actually, and to really go out there and do something. Rather than a lot of academic research, which kind of tends to sit in a journal article somewhere and be read by a small group of other academics. And arts-based research is very, very different to that. There are three kind of methodological strands that collaborative poetics kind of clap together. The first of these is poetic inquiry. And poetic inquiry is just using poetry as a research tool, essentially. There's loads that we could say about poetic inquiry. There's probably one distinction that I kind of want to make for the purpose of this talk, and that's between poetry which emphasizes participants' voices, so it might be doing interviews with people and then transcribing those and creating poems from those interview transcripts, for instance. And then poetry which emphasizes the researcher's voice, so researchers writing poems about their experiences. And that latter form links into autoethnography. So sometimes they're called poetic autoethnographers when it's that autobiographical poetry. Autoethnography is where people create usually creative, evocative, but also analytical texts, which are autobiographical. So researchers write about their experiences creatively, and they link those in then to broader kind of social issues and social understandings and debates. And these are fantastic methods, and they can do all sorts of things that standard academic research can't do. They can deal with ambiguity, and they can deal with silence, and they can deal with multiplicity, and they can deal with liminality, that stuff on the edges of things, which a lot of research methods really struggle to deal with. Collaborative research is about taking participants on board as co-researchers. So it's about treating them as active members of a research team and trying to dissolve those kind of power differentials between the person who's doing the research and the person who's being researched. But instead treating them as part of a research team. They have a say in the design of the study, what they want to get out of it, the focus of it, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm trying to kind of bring all those three things together. One of the things about collaborative research, which is really good, is that it can answer to some of the criticisms that are made about poetic inquiry and autoethnography. There are two main criticisms that tend to get made about those, and one is that it can be very inward-looking, even narcissistic, because it's researchers writing about themselves, or it's very detailed accounts of very small sort of experiences. Collaborating with participants helps us to challenge that, helps us to go beyond just the researcher's story. But collaborative poetics is also collaborative in terms of collaborating with artists, which is a really important part of it. So it's about collaborating with poets and with artists. And that can help to kind of get over another criticism that can be aimed at this research, which is that it can be aesthetically weak. So sometimes you see autoethnography or poetic inquiry works which aren't great pieces of creative writing or aren't great poems. And by collaborating with people who are actually experts in creative writing, experts in poetry, experts in writing and performance, it helps us to answer to that critique. Okay, so this is the pilot study. In terms of the underlying framework that I would identify as kind of belonging or at least dialoguing with critical community psychology. And critical community psychology is about working with communities to do things that matter to them, to focus on issues that are relevant and meaningful to them, and to produce work which can make meaningful change and realistic change for members of the community. So it's very much kind of based on that community focus, hence the involvement of help. The critical part as well is also about emphasizing politics. So mainstream social science research depicts itself really as being about labeling, categorizing the world. It's objective researchers standing at the world, and they're looking at it and they're analyzing it, they're theorizing it. They're not being involved in it in any way. They're standing outside of it. And critical community psychologists say that's not possible and it's not desirable. Actually, our research has political impacts. And so therefore, the response that critical community psychologists would have to that is we should therefore seek to have the kind of positive political impact that we want to see. If we're going to change the world through our research, we should be explicitly trying to change it in ways that we think are desirable. So themes about power politics and participatory research are kind of prominent in this. So within this pilot study, I worked with these young spoken word artists, and I worked with them as co-researchers. I set out basically the aims you saw a couple of slides ago, and then everything else came from dialogue with them. And one of the things that came out was about a week and a half in, we kind of realized that discrimination was this enormous topic and that we needed to do some delineating within that. And so they decided that they wanted to come up with a series of themes that would guide our research and that would guide our writing. And these are the themes we came up with. So exploring facets of privilege. we very quickly realized that you can't talk about discrimination without talking about privilege. And the two really go hand in hand. And we were all privileged, actually, as well as all experiencing discrimination. Questioning our conditioning, making connections between personal experiences and big issues, something autoethnography particularly really tries to do. Unpacking flaws and subtleties within ideals and exposing microaggressions. So those small pervasive actions through which most of us tend to experience discrimination. So it might be not seeing yourself represented in media. It might be being catcalled. It might be somebody being served before you even though you were ahead of them in the queue. These things that kind of characterize our daily lives all the time. And that was one of the things we wanted to focus on. So I worked with 7 young spoken word artists, and we worked together as a research collective. I use that term to emphasize the collaborative nature of the research, but also the fact that we were doing something artistic, so we were working together as a collective. And we worked together for 6 weeks, over 18 days it worked out, and we worked together from 10 o'clock in the morning through to 4:30 in the afternoon every day. So it was a really intensive kind of period of working together. And it was conceptualized as a knowledge and skill sharing thing. So they brought with them expertise in spoken word writing and spoken word performance. They also brought with them expertise in their own personal experience. They're the experts in their personal lived experience. And then I brought with me expertise around social science methods and theory and so on, and we kind of put that all into the mix and kind of jiggled it about to see what we'd come up with. So we carried out collaborative arts-based research, and this meant they were involved in research design activities. So they did things like define the research timetable, the timetable of what we would do together and what we would do when. They worked out what they wanted out of it, so what the outputs would be. They worked out what the focus would be, things like the guiding themes on the previous slide. We did seminars, workshops, and activities around social science methods and theory. So I did some lectures on critical psychology approaches to discrimination, for instance. I taught them about research design, data collection, data analysis, that kind of thing. We did spoken word writing and performance masterclasses. So we had 4 spoken word artists come in from outside to give these guest masterclasses. And this was partly kind of payment for the co-researchers, because it's a really desirable thing. And it was also something that helped to kind of feed into the project as well. So they taught us about writing, they taught us about performance. And I participated in those as well as a poet, rather than kind of standing outside of it in any way. I was just kind of another participant in it. And then the other thing that we did a lot of was poetry writing, performance, and editing activities. So we did things like free write, which is where you just kind of write what's in your head and try not to edit it. You just kind of write what comes out. We did things like writing poems to act as the script or the commentary for video materials. We wrote group poems. We did lots of performance. So one of the things that came out of this was we did a show, and we wrote that show together, and we rehearsed that show in our meetings together. And we also did a load of editing activities. So we would edit each other's poems in pairs. We did editing workshops and that kind of thing. So all of that kind of came together, and that was how we spent our 6 weeks. And within this, then poetry was a form of data collection. So things like free writes were used to kind of generate our thoughts. Composition and editing activities were used to kind of organize our thoughts in different ways. Poetry was a form of data analysis. So for instance, the iPoems that we created using the listening guide method. We thought about our writing as an analytic process, which didn't just describe things, but illuminated and transformed them as well. And then poetry was also a form of data dissemination. So we had the show, and we also had a chapbook, and they were the 2 main kind of forms of dissemination. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple of poems to you. This first one was written by Anara Lalani, and she was one of 2 of the 7 co-researchers who didn't quite make it to the end of the research. They both made it very nearly to the end, but then weren't able to participate in the chapbook and the show, unfortunately, due to personal reasons. But Anara very kindly sent me some of the poems that she created, and this is one of those. And this was created using the Beats cut-up technique, which is literally cutting up texts. And you can do it in different kinds of ways. You can take 2 texts, cut them in half and put them next to each other and read what's created. You can do it with quarters, Or you can do what Inara did here, which is more of a kind of mosaic of just chopping them up and moving them around and mixing them about. And the idea of the method is it allows you to kind of disrupt the narrative, disrupt normal ways of thinking. You can look at things in different ways. You get new stories kind of emerging and new ways of looking at text. So I had 4 academic texts about discrimination, and we created these cut-up poems with them, and this is Inara's. I decided to work on myself, encourage diversity, paint thinner fumes, rage at the universe, remain focused instead of half-conscious, and rise to the surface from the slight. My veins have become sensitive to hurling fireballs of words, because remarks can inflict bruises, since rage freezes reason. Our country is not immune. I can be pretty sure that my neighbours turn on the television or open the front page to see a society saturated by the smell of gunpowder, toxins spewed by racists. Colour made it what it is, a sense of entitlement. All Asians look the same, even though they cut their hair differently and stock different staple foods in their pantry. I just want to walk away, testify to the existence of stereotypes, and allow my skin colour to work against myths. The second one I wanted to read was one that I wrote, so I participated in all of this stuff as a poet as well. Every time we did writing activities, I did writing activities too. And this is something that came out of an activity we did where we created poems from interview transcripts. So I taught them about interview technique and about writing interview schedules. We then compiled an interview schedule together. We interviewed each other in pairs. We went off and transcribed them. We came back. I taught them about thematic analysis, which is a way of analysing the data to look for recurrent patterns or themes. And then we did a thematic analysis as a group, and we came out with exemplary quotations for each of the themes. And what you would then do as an academic is go off, write up your article, write this up as a journal article, and use those quotations to illustrate each of the themes. But what we did instead was we wrote poems out of them. And there's a couple of these in the book. There were a couple in the show, and this is the one that I wrote. And in this poem, all of the words that you hear in it are the words from the interviews, except for 2. There's 2 I changed, and they're just like joining words like and or but. But everything else is basically taken from the interview transcripts and from this process of analysis. So this is I'm not hiding, relief. Listen to me. It wasn't just in my head, just a bad experience. There's something really wrong here. Control is a big thing, built into the stones. Walking down the street is a revolutionary act. It's the vague stuff, the small stuff, a wave of excusable actions. Erasure is a thing too, wrapped up in a joke, so you need to laugh it off. Not important. People still ask, you're not really tut, and stare at that potentially problematic part. Their eyes say it all. There are dynamics in the conversation. You just let people think, quieting yourself. We are isolated. Some people are hurt less. I get to choose my battles, choose when or if I want to put myself in danger. I know where I'm not wanted, where I want and need to be. Who has authority? Feels entitled to my attention, time, body. But when I'm on stage, I feel powerful. From the inside looking out, I feel safe. Nothing can touch me. I'm one of the ones who's right, has a voice. Then I have no choice but to take whatever may come my way. Okay, so this is what we did with the poems. We had a spoken word show in Mainline Theatre in Montreal. We also put a chat book together, which is over here. It's available for the grand total of £7 if anybody is interested. And all of the money from this will go back into this work, so it's not going to buy me shoes or anything. But there's a selection of 22 poems in there, and there's also some description about some of what we did. And we distributed a load of those in Canada and also here. We sold a lot of them at the show. We also have 3 video poems. One of the things we did was we got together with another group of young people who were working on a different research project out there, who were young musicians, and they were doing a lot of work around creating music videos. So we got together with them and we made some video poems. And they're in a kind of early stage of edit, so they're another thing on my to-do list at the moment. And then we're creating a project video. So Xander, who you can see with the guitar there, is currently making a video. I videoed a load of our work together. I videoed a load of the workshop work and the show that we did. And they are currently putting it all together as a video. And the video is going to be both kind of showcasing the project and the method, but also their personal perspective and take on it. So it will be its kind of own thing as well, which will be really nice. So in terms of evaluating this, we had 48 audience members at the show. We sold mostly 75 chapbooks in Canada, and then we've sold some more since we've been over here. And then there's also an audience from things like this and academic publications and so on. So in terms of kind of your standard piece of academic research, it's already looking quite good. It's not just 4 academics reading a journal article. So it's already kind of got out there. And things that the audience members said were things like beautiful. It's one of the most powerful shows I've ever been to. So we got some amazing feedback from the show. I then did some interviews and some focus groups with the co-researchers and the workshop facilitators, and I haven't analysed those properly yet. One of the co-researchers, Simon Banterob, is currently doing a thematic analysis on that with a PhD student at the McGill University, Hani Sadati. So this is very kind of preliminary, but it is indicative of the kinds of things that people said. So co-researchers said things like, I've grown as a person and a poet. It was really inspiring to my poetic and academic world to be part of this. And the workshop facilitators said things like, in the end, I witnessed an individual and a collective transformation in the participants, the project leader, and in myself as well. I should say I did say to them that I was really interested in negative comments as well, because the whole idea was to develop the method. And actually knowing what didn't work is just as useful in view of kind of developing the method. But there was very, very little that people had to say that wasn't positive. So. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about, and I'm only going to talk about it really briefly, because I'll kind of talk about it more in the workshop if people are coming to that, and I'll also write about it and things. But about developing the method and what we actually kind of did and what we got out of it. I put together this fire triangle because I wanted to kind of illustrate that all 3 of these components are essential. They're interrelated components in order for the method to work, and you can't take one out or the fire goes out. So in this fire triangle, you've got the fuel of personal experiences. So without the personal experiences, there's nothing to burn. The quantity, the quality, the shape, and the content of these determine how easily the fire can burn and how hot it burns. The heat then is the poetry and the spoken word. This is the heat of creativity, of emotionality, and of passion. So this is the element that grabs you and it maintains your attention. It's also the element through which the fire spreads. So it's through this that we spread our messages and we spread our methods. And then the social science research and theory is the oxygen that breathes life into the flames. So it's the reaction of the fuel, the personal experiences, with the oxygen that enables the heat to be released. So that the social science theory and methods adds a whole different range of things to this fire. It adds authority so that people listen to these narratives. It adds access to new forms of different forms of knowledge, different resources, different audiences. It adds systematic and robust methods to the mix. So all of these are kind of needed in order for the fire to kind of work. Okay. And then what I learned, I'm only going to kind of skip over this quite briefly, but true multidisciplinary and collaborative work means taking on the aims, concerns, methods, products, and evaluative framework of others. And this can be really great. It can be really facilitating because it means that it gives you new ways of thinking about things. It gives you new kinds of stories, new tools. It gives you new outputs. But it can also be quite restrictive, actually, because you have to take on board all of the constraints of that as well. And one example would be that all of the poets, I think, created poems which I really liked and really said what I thought, kind of maybe needed to be said, and really summed stuff up for me, and then didn't want to do anything with them. Didn't want to put them in the show, didn't want to put them in the book, generally because they thought they weren't good enough. And I was kind of, really desperately wanting to use these poems, but you have to respect the knowledge and the skills and the understanding that people bring from other disciplines. So it can be restrictive as well. And Inara's was one of those poems that didn't make it to the show or the book. Tips and tricks from me. Number 1 rule, if you're going to do something like this, would be to be flexible. I'm the kind of person who likes to plan everything in advance. So going into a 6-week project, not knowing what I was going to do after the first 2 hours was really quite scary. I got around it by putting this together, which was a resource pack, and it's, I sort of accidentally wrote a syllabus, but it's full of articles, workshop slides, exercises, and so on. But I knew that I was not necessarily going to even use it, or I might use it in a different order or in a different way. So you can come in with a plan. You have to be prepared to rip that plan up when you get in there. Skill up, you don't know everything. And this is where collaborating with other people comes in. That's kind of the whole point, actually collaborate with people who know about the art form or who know about the social sciences. But you still have to understand the art form that you're working with. And that's really, really important. So you're collaborating with people, but you have to know what it is that you're working with. You have to understand that medium. Know when to give your advice and opinion and know when to lead was a big lesson that I learned. Collaborative research is all about seeding that power and that authority and that leadership. And so it's really tempting to just always sit in the background. But actually, sometimes you need to lead. And actually, if you're conceptualizing this as knowledge exchange and skill exchange and as a partnership, you're doing a disservice to that if you don't lead when you need to. Sometimes the participants, the co-researchers should be leading, sometimes you should be leading. And that was quite a big lesson for me, actually, to learn that there are times when that's needed. Be realistic about what you can achieve. In 6 weeks, I think we achieved a phenomenal amount, but I wouldn't go into a project expecting to achieve that much. I would go for one output. Be reflexive and invest in the research. I was able to talk about discrimination because I've experienced homophobia and I've experienced sexism and misogyny, and so it was something I could talk about. But even if you're dealing with something that's kind of not your issue, that honesty is still really, really important. And it means doing research in quite a different way to the way in which academics are probably used to doing research. You need to give of yourself in the research. And remember self-care. And this needs to be planned into the research, but it could be something as simple as giving co-researchers the permission to not be there. One of our participants didn't turn up for 2 weeks because she needed time to process everything that was coming up. And that was really important for her. And the last thing about tips and tricks really is that one of the questions I asked in the focus groups and the interviews was I said to the participants, what advice would you have for participants, for poets, for academics who are about to do this? And they said, for participants, allow yourself to be vulnerable, but take care of yourself. For poets, throw yourself into it, right, make the most of it, just go for it. For academics, be open-minded and listen to people's experiences, listen to their ways of working and their skills. Be prepared for messy emotions. So there's this wonderful quote from one co-researcher who said, you can't expect to come into something like this completely distant and sterile and actually get anything out of it. You can't treat people like a chemical environment. And then appreciate the arts. If possible, be an artist, but the whole point of this method is you don't have to be an artist. But you do need to appreciate the art. It's really, really important because you need to understand then what resources you need, what opportunities it gives, what constraints there are. You need to know about that. And that's, where collaboration comes in, but you have to be prepared to learn from other people. Academics aren't always very good at that. Okay, so what I want to do next is I want to develop this particularly as a three-way collaboration. I want it to be something which I can develop more for people who are not poets and not social scientists, people who are members of community groups who want to talk about their experiences, collaborating with social scientists and collaborating with poets. It's a three-way collaboration. My plan, depending on how I go, is to maybe next summer think about developing a funding bid for working on that more. And I'm thinking at the moment about working with people who have contested and invisible illnesses, but it's very open slate at the moment. And then the last thing I was going to do is plug my workshop, but I can't plug my workshop because it's full. But what I would say is we've got a waiting list for it, and if you want to go on the waiting list, if that waiting list gets big enough, I'm going to do it again. At the moment, it's kind of already nipping on the heels of big enough to run it again. So if anybody's interested in doing this, please come up to Bethan, volunteering you, or come up to me and just put your name down for it or email us afterwards. And like I say, if that waiting list gets long enough, I'll just do it again. So, okay, that was it.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was brilliant. It was really interesting because we met, I think, over a year ago to talk about you going to do this and us planning these workshops, and it's just amazing to see how much you've actually managed to do. And I think your kind of enthusiasm and energy for this is really uplifting. So yeah, really, really fascinating. So I guess we've got about 20 minutes for questions. I will say that we've got the room for a little bit longer after. We'll finish at 1:30, but if people do want to kind of hang around a bit afterwards and finish off biscuits, sign up for stuff and talk to Helen afterwards, then yeah, and buy books, of course, the important thing, then please do that. But we will finish at 1:30. So yeah, I think I'll hand the mic back to you so you can repeat questions for people. But if people would like to have any comments or any questions, we'll just say this is a fairly mixed audience, so just the normal thing in our seminars is to ask people to not use acronyms, and if you're using jargon, please explain what it is, and you might even want to ask Helen a bit more about some of the vocabulary that's been used and any of that, then please feel free to do that, because it is a mixed audience in that way. We want to try and make it accessible.
Well, it was really to go out and work with the Participatory Cultures Lab. So I'm glad you asked, because I should have mentioned that. So there's a Participatory Cultures Lab at the University of McGill, and Professor Claudia Mitchell out there, who have experience and expertise around arts-based research. So the idea was to go out and work in that environment with those resources, and with those people. So, and the grant that I got from the NCRM was a visiting scholarship grant, so it was all about kind of going somewhere and doing. The Participatory Cultures Lab. They've got a website, if you want to look it up. It's a nice little website, actually. They do some really interesting things. Yeah, I just kind of put calls out everywhere I could think of, really. I started off knowing sort of one person, really, because I'm a poet, I kind of had some connections which helped. So I knew one spoken word artist who actually came and did one of the workshops with us, and I asked her, and she kind of enabled, so I guess snowball something, she enabled me to kind of get hold of other people. So we put call outs with spoken word organisations in Montreal, on Facebook pages with spoken word clubs and nights. They spread the word through workshops they were doing. She spread the word to other people who spread the word to other people. So I just kind of put advertisements on Facebook pages, web pages, sent loads of emails out, all that kind of thing. Yeah, the idea was to work with young poets, which was as much as anything because the project would then benefit them more. People who are already kind of professional spoken word artists are going to get less out of it and going to want paying more. So partly it was about that, as well as looking at their experiences. So we were looking at people who were 16 to 25. Beyond that, I had no demographic criteria except that they needed to have experienced discrimination, but that's a very, very broad thing, and applies to an awful lot of people. So in terms of expertise, they needed to have experience as spoken word artists, in terms of performing and in terms of writing, because that really matters. You know, part of the project is about creating aesthetically strong pieces, but that was really sort of down to judgment, I guess. There weren't kind of fixed criteria, benchmarks. Does that make sense? Were there any requirements or prerequisites for co-researchers? Yeah, I think I just answered that, although your face suggests I might not have. But really they had to have experience as spoken word artists. They had to have experience as performers and as writers, and they had to have experienced discrimination, and they had to be between 16 and 25, and that was it. Oh, and local to Montreal, because I paid for metro passes. But I did have a couple of people applying from Vancouver, so we'd clearly got out. There were networks around slam and performance poetry, and we'd really got out. But I had someone applying from Vancouver, some person applying from Toronto, so I had to rephrase when I said I was paying travel expenses. But I feel like I didn't quite answer your question. Yeah, no, they emailed me and they sent me a couple of pieces of their work, so I did ask to see some of their work. But it was fairly informal other than that. But I wanted to recruit participants before I got out there, because I needed to kind of be able to hit the ground running when I got there, really. But yeah, that's probably that I missed out, that I asked them to send me some of their work. Yeah, so what the difference is between spoken word and non-spoken word poetry, and why I wanted to work specifically with spoken word poetry. Yeah, well, I guess, I would consider myself to be a performance poet or a spoken word artist. So in terms of my skills, experience, and interests, it kind of chimes with that. In terms of my contacts, it chimes with that. I know there are real networks nationally and internationally, so I could kind of tap into those. But really, the reason that I like spoken word poetry is because it is accessible, because it's engaging, because the whole point of it really is about to take poetry out there to people who wouldn't sit down and read poetry at home necessarily. So it's really about connecting with people who aren't necessarily into poetry. And I really think that performance poetry, spoken word poetry really does that. So the difference really is that it's about performing it. So it's not about, kind of reading it from a piece of paper in front of a lectern, whatever. It's about, when you see performance poetry, spoken word poetry, it's very much a performance. It's very alive. It's very engaging and accessible. And it's all about that. So that was why I was interested in working with it, really. Yeah. Yeah. So how did we edit it and still maintain a kind of authentic voice and keep that kind of balance? Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things to say is that I didn't edit it. I saw them as having the expertise in writing, and therefore they edited it. So we had editing workshops. I had editing activities that we went through, and we edited things in groups. So we made suggestions about how something could be conveyed kind of more clearly, or how it could be more aesthetically strong. But the editorial decisions were all made by the authors. So I didn't come in at any point and change anything that they'd written. So I guess those were decisions that they all made as individuals on individual pieces, in the way that you would do when you write a piece anyway, I guess. Is this saying what I want it to say? Will it grab people? Will it really kind of engage them? Will it change their minds in some way? I guess I can talk about it in terms of how I edit my pieces. I had a piece that I wrote which was about kind of microaggressions, so those sort of everyday little mini sort of aggressions. And it was about trying to say to someone, look, I know that you're not the kind of person who is going to kind of beat me up, but you do this stuff and this makes a difference. But the poem initially started off as being quite aggressive, really, and it was quite kind of like, all this stuff has happened to me. And then I wanted to change it because I thought, that's not going to, people aren't going to listen to that. That's not going to change anything, because most of the people in the audience, people who are going to beat me up because I'm gay are probably not going to listen to my poem anyway. The people I'm speaking to are the people who are perpetuating homophobia, but not necessarily thinking all gay people are horrible or whatever, but they're doing things, they've taken on these discourses, these ways of being. And so I wanted to tone down the poem, if you like, in order to speak to those people. And so I changed it to try and make it much more a little bit kind of calmer and a little bit more accessible and connect with people. So when I was making that editorial decision, I was thinking about my audience as well as about my voice. And I guess because we're doing our own editing, it feels to me that the voice remains authentic, but you're taking on board kind of artistic considerations. Yeah, so have I worked with visual arts? What do I think about that? And also, what do I think about using this kind of method, not about personal experiences, but about sort of more abstract or broad issues? Yeah, in answer to your first question, I have worked with visual artists. It was about personal experience, though. I put on my first foray into arts-based research was working around dementia, and I worked with a photographer, a poet, and a musician, and also a visual artist to put on an exhibition, which and work with people with dementia to put on this exhibition, which talked about their lived experiences of dementia. And so, yeah, all of these techniques and the things I'm talking about and the ways of doing things translate to different art forms. I'm not a visual artist, so it's a different experience for me. And I think for me, there's more involved then in learning about the medium before I start off. In terms of looking at more kind of abstract things that aren't about personal experiences, yeah, I mean, again, this is a flexible method which could be used to look at anything, if you like. But my interest really is on personal experiences, but it doesn't stop at personal experiences. It's about the personal experiences illuminating the bigger picture. So I'm not making that division between the two. The phrase "the personal is political" is really very much about that. So we're not trying to simply illuminate 7 people's experiences of discrimination. We're trying to say big things about, what discrimination is, what privilege is, about what it feels like, about what it does, and talking to the really broader ideas and issues and theories. So I would say that you don't need to disconnect the two. Actually, it's about how you see what you're creating, rather than necessarily where you start off. Does that make sense? My opening poem, which I think you missed, was about kind of comparing the research experience to looking at sand through a microscope. And if you've ever seen sand through a microscope, it doesn't look, it's not beige drifts anymore. It's lots of little tiny little pieces of multicolored shells. But the idea is that by looking at those tiny little pieces of multicolored shells, you illuminate the beach. So I think that you can absolutely use it to talk about these broader issues, and you can absolutely use it with visual art. Yeah. So just so I have to do the repeating thing so that people can hear. So just that you were trying to work out kind of how you could access it, how it might connect to your research, because what you do is very different, basically. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess when it comes down to it, I guess you need to do that and kind of work out what the entry point is. If you're interested in this and you think that it's something which has potential, then there must be something there. That there is something there that you can hook into. There's something that you see in it. So I guess you need to kind of step back and think, what is it that I see in it, and why, and how do I get into that? Because arts-based research, in terms of that broad umbrella term, is incredibly broad, and there are so many different ways you can do it, and different aims and different foci. What I'm talking about is a very specific thing, but arts-based research in that broad umbrella, the world is your oyster, really. I'm doing a lot of shellfish-related things today, aren't I? Were there any prompts that elicited deeper responses than others? I think that it really depended on the individual, actually. I would do an activity with them, or one of the spoken word workshop facilitators would do an activity with them, and I'd think, I'm not sure this is going anywhere. It's not working for me. I'm really struggling to engage with it. And then someone would come out with something brilliant. So every activity that we did, at least one person seemed to hook onto. I found there was an activity that Tanya Evanson did, who was one of the poetry workshop facilitators, which really worked for me, which was about, the prompt was write about a lake which is being viewed by or from the perspective of somebody who has just committed a murder motivated by hate. Don't mention the murder. And that, for me, really was a great prompt, and I really kind of went with it. But there were other ones that worked for other people. So I actually put together a whole series of prompts that people could kind of dip in and out of as an extra thing outside of our sessions as well. So it's different strokes for different folks, I guess. Okay, so poets generally find it easier to express vulnerability than people who are non-poets. If you're doing it with non-poets, how would you prepare them for that? Yeah, I think that it's a big thing in any group, actually. And you need to spend time getting to know each other. You need to spend time doing things that aren't about your personal experiences at all. And you're talking about discrimination. It's an incredibly emotive topic. We didn't actually talk about our personal experiences of discrimination for, a couple of weeks, I think. We did a lot of stuff which is about the research methods, about understanding theories about discrimination, about exploring other people's texts about discrimination, things like that cut-up poem. And it took a while before we started talking to each other about our own personal experiences, actually. So I think that you might be surprised how difficult, sort of artistic, open, emotional kind of people like poets, how difficult it is for them to be vulnerable. And actually, if you looked at that advice that they would give to someone, one of the big pieces of advice was allow yourself to be vulnerable, because that was something that we all kind of struggled with to some extent. And it's difficult for academics too, because that's not how you're normally involved in research. To kind of lay it all on the table, is actually quite unusual and quite difficult. So I think we did do a lot of preparing the ground, actually. A big part is getting the group together, getting that group report together, making sure people feel comfortable and happy with each other and talking about themselves. Another thing that was very useful for me was that I kind of started first. So I kind of told them about some of my experiences first. It's more difficult if it's not your issue, if you like, it's not something you've experienced. But still, I think allowing yourself to be vulnerable as a researcher and to be honest and to engage in it and invest in it is another big thing that's important. Yeah, so I hate to summarize such a complex question so briefly, but kind of how do you look after people? How do you, when people are very vulnerable and you're dealing with very difficult issues, and how do you, and you use the word therapeutic, and I would say one of the things that you do to look after people is you don't call it therapy, unless you are doing it as therapy, in which case great, but I'm not a therapist, and I think that those boundaries, although in a way it's a very unbounded thing to do, this kind of research, I think that boundary is very important. I think it's very important that you don't come across and you don't present yourself as a therapist if that's not what you're doing. And so I think that's actually very important. Therapeutic is different, of course, but it's not therapy. I didn't conceptualize it as therapy. There were things around it, around empowerment, absolutely, and about enabling people to engage with and explore difficult and troubling issues. I think you're right. I think it absolutely has to be built into the project. I think you have to go beyond those standard social science tick the ethics box stuff. And you have to really care, and you have to really work it in. We did a whole range of different things. One of the things we did was reflexive diaries, which you will probably know about. But a reflexive diary is where you kind of explore your personal experiences and responses to the research. And so I taught them about that, and we kept reflexive diaries. We talked about reflexivity, and that was actually one of the ways which we nudged towards starting to talk about our personal experiences as well at that point. Again, the supportive group is massively important. The group dynamics really matter, and that's really, really important. And when we talked about, because we talked about several times through the project about self-care and about looking after each other, what people kept coming back to was, I feel okay in this group. And that really, really mattered. It was really important to people. And then, like I say, things like giving people permission to not be there. And of course, you also point people towards the direction of support services, but that's your standard social science ethics stuff. Actually, it needs to be much, much more worked into a project than that. And I must admit, from the outset, I didn't really realise quite how important it would be, or quite how emotional a topic it might be for people, including myself. So I really think it's important that that is a core part of this kind of research, and that it's worked in and that it's taken seriously.
One last kind of thank you to Helen, if we can.